Hi, I'm Mary Crowley, and this is Arts and More. My guest today is Alastair Stout, Minister of Music at Grace Church. Alastair, I think you've got a very, very interesting life story. You're in Rutland, Vermont now. Where did you come from? Where did you grow up?
Mary, my father was born in the Shetland Islands, which are a group of islands about 200 miles off the northeast coast of Scotland.
That's up there.
It's midway between Scotland and Norway. I mean, it's in the middle of the North Atlantic and the North Sea. It's a wild and rugged place, but a wonderful place for a young boy to grow up and have his childhood. And I was there until I was about 10 years old. And when I was 10, my parents offered to put me into a school down in the south of England where I sang in a cathedral for 4 years. So from 10 to 14, I sang every day in the cathedral, rehearsed about 4 hours each day, and had a real amazing upbringing in a rich choral tradition. It's also where I started learning the organ. But Shetland never really left me. Going home for holidays was a wonderful source of recharging my batteries and seeing friends and this kind of thing. And it was the landscape and the weather that really influenced my music and what I was interested in terms of writing music and what I would like to practice as an organist. I grew up in a folk music tradition. Everybody else played fiddles or accordions growing up around me. I was kind of the odd one out playing the organ and doing choral singing. But they embraced me with open arms, and I would always accompany the fiddles on the piano and have fun at holiday times. When I was away as a chorister singing, we sang a lot of music by a Dutch-German composer called Nicholas Bruns. And Nicholas Bruns was particularly close to my heart as a composer because besides being an organist and a composer, which is what I was interested in, he was also a very prolific violin player. And the story goes apparently that he would play his violin with his hands whilst accompanying himself using the organ pedals at the same time. Quite an amazing, talented musician. And so what I'd like to play to you today is a piece by Nicholas Bruns, his amazing preludium in E minor. And you can hear, I think, in the middle of the piece, a section that I play very quickly with my hands and with my feet. You could imagine him playing the fiddle and accompanying himself at the same time during this piece.
So, Alastair, after leaving Shetland, what came next?
Well, after leaving Shetland and having time down at Ely Cathedral singing, I went on to study music at the Royal College of Music in London. I was in London for 8 years, where I did various degrees, and I finished off doing a PhD in composition at the University of London. And after that, I couldn't do any more degrees, so I thought, well, what on earth am I going to do? A friend of mine was an organist in Akron, Ohio, and he invited me over to do a concert. And so that summer I came over to Ohio and played some organ recitals. And he suggested that I, come to America and travel and explore and work in the US for a bit. And I thought, that'd be great for a few years. I'd love to travel and see the world. So I came over to Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. There was a little town on the outskirts of Pittsburgh called Coriopolis. And on the American Guild of Organists website, there's a list of jobs. And the very first job was C. Coriopolis. And so I applied, and they accepted me, and I went over, and the few years that I expected to be in Coriopolis turned into 15 wonderful, wonderful years in Pittsburgh. It was a remarkable city, very, very friendly folk, and a fantastic music scene that we really, really enjoyed for 15 years. And it was at that time also that I met my partner, Krista. After 15 years in Pittsburgh, we traveled up to New England a lot on vacation, and we thought it would be fun to explore this area a bit. And luckily for me, Grace Church in Rutland was looking for a minister of music. And so we came up to Rutland in 2017, and it's been a really wonderful experience here at Grace Church. Mary, we have a very vibrant music ministry here at the church.
Absolutely.
A wonderful team of musicians to work with. And it's a very busy position of Minister of Music here. We have a lot going on. There are 7 different choirs here at the church, all the way from young children up to adults and bell choir. And of course we have the large Rutland area chorus that meets twice a year, famously for that wonderful performance of the Messiah in December. So there's a lot going on. The Messiah this year is on December 8th, and this year we're very excited because we're going to be premiering a new work that won the Grace Church Composition Competition. A wonderful composer, his name is Michael Sitton, and he wrote a piece called O Emmanuel that the Rutland Area Chorus is going to be singing alongside the Messiah at Christmas. And then just a couple of weeks after that, we have our Lessons and Carols service here at the church, where all the different choirs perform that wonderful tradition of 9 lessons and carols. And once we're in the new year, the Handbell Choir is offering a concert on January 15th. They're being joined by a really fantastic group, Northern Bronze Handbell Group. And so they'll be offering a concert then. Following that, we have Jazz Sunday later in January. And then in February, perhaps the event closest to my heart is our folk music weekend. It's going to be February 22nd and 23rd. We're joined by 2 wonderful musicians, John Kirk and Trish Miller, and they come over from Saratoga Springs, and on Saturday we offer a Shetland night where we feed all our visitors tatties, baked potatoes, with all the fillings, all the toppings, and then we follow that with some slides of Shetland and then a wonderful ceilidh dance in the evening. And the next day, John and Trish join us in the morning for worship, and we perform traditional music. And so this year we're singing Shenandoah and some other wonderful American folk songs. Coming from Shetland, folk music is very close to my heart, and there's a little piece that I grew up with that I'm particularly fond with. It's a Shetland slow air called Margaret Ann Robertson. And Margaret Ann was a young girl that lost her life only when she was a young teenager. And this is a tune her father wrote in her memory, which I'm going to play on the organ.
Yes, and the melody line at some point, to me, it begins the piece, suggests a girl.
Absolutely. I'm using a very distant 4-foot flute on the organ, and it suggests certainly Margaret Ann in her youth. Also think about seagulls and birds soaring around the cliffs of Shetland whilst the white foamy waters beneath. And then I use a reed, a crumhorn on the organ, and again that could be very similar to a bagpipe or a Scottish pipe. which then recalls the same tune. It's a beautiful piece. Yeah.
All right, we'll hear the piece now. Alastair, so you grew up in Shetland, you went to London, then Pittsburgh area, and now you're here in this tiny little city in Vermont. How is it?
In many ways, Mary, it's like coming home almost. You know, there are many similarities between Vermont and the north of Scotland, surprisingly, or perhaps not surprisingly. But the weather is not that different in some respects. It's a lot windier in Shetland, but the winters are cold and long and dark nights. That's certainly reminiscent of growing up in Shetland. The little hamlets, the little towns that dot the Vermont countryside is very, very similar to the Shetland landscape, which has these little villages here and there. But I think perhaps what's most similar is the wonderful social sense that I've found in Vermont in terms of the people are very, very friendly, and that's very similar to the folk of Shetland. I think it's because we have these long, dark nights together. You have to get on with each other to survive them. And so the dancing that happens, Krista and I have been going out to the Teignmouth Ceilidh nights they have, these dancers, and that is just so similar to going to the local hall in Shetland and having Saturday night dances. So that is a wonderful thing to find. I thought that only happened in Scotland, but in fact it's all over Vermont too. The mountains and the seasons are similar to the area that I grew up in, and I really relish those. Growing up in Shetland and the landscape, the weather, like I said, the rawness of the environment is really what made me write music. It was very easy there to put notes down on paper
And
because...
the piece that you played, you composed when you were how old?
Well, the piece that's coming up is a piece that is based on an oil disaster that happened in Shetland in 1993. At the time, I was 17. And the weather brought this awful, the huge oil tanker was sailing past the island. The weather was atrocious in early January, and it caused the engine to fail, and the ship came onto the rocks and burst open, and the oil spilled out. But it was also such appalling weather that dispersed the oil as well at the end. So in fact, it wasn't as bad a disaster as it could have been. However, my little sister, who was 11 at the time, wrote an article for a national youth newspaper, and the article sparked in me a musical response. And I wrote this piece for piano based on the disaster. It's called "I Wish the Sea Was Blue," and at the time, it was pitch black with oil. And the smell was throughout the island. I mean, it really was appalling. But it was the landscapes and the seascapes of Shetland that influenced my writing. Going off with my dad in his boat, was as much a lesson in orchestration as any that I had in London at college. So listening to pieces by Debussy, or he wrote La Mer, which is a wonderful description of the sea. And growing up in Shetland, that was conjured up every day in my life. Just imagine opening the door and hearing Debussy's La Mer, and there it was, So not only that, but the textures of the landscape. It's full of heather, there's no trees on Shetland. It's a very rugged, bare landscape. And all the instrumentation of the pieces, like how you write for strings or for woodwind or brass, it was all suggested in the landscape. And I've never found that anywhere else, apart from here in Vermont. There's something similar about the textures of the landscape that allow creativity to just ooze out of every pore. And I really, really appreciate that. And what's perhaps been the most wonderful thing to find in Vermont is the local talent is extraordinary here. And every week somebody's coming into my office and introducing themselves and explaining that they're either a musician or an artist or a writer. And they show me their work, and it's stunningly good. And I really appreciate being in that environment along with these other artists and musicians. So what we're going to hear next is this piece that I wrote when I was 17 called "I Wish the Sea Was Blue." It evokes this disaster. There's a little folk song that kind of comes out of the mists of the beginning of the piano. It's very low and quiet. Gradually this melody emerges, this little Shetland folk song, and then it blossoms into this kind of slight wind, and then it's a full force 11 gale, and then it subsides again. Because at the time we didn't think that the ship was going to be gone as quickly as it was. But in fact, so the piece ends kind of soft and a little bit sad, but in fact,
things are all right.
Things are all right, which is wonderful. But this is the piece "I Wish the Sea Was Blue."
Okay.